Good morning. Today is Friday, April 14th, 2023. This morning, permit me to share the third of a three-part series paying tribute to the Rav, Rabbi Yosef Soloveitchik, whose 30th Yartzeit was last Sunday on the 18th of Nissan. And today, allow me to share a glimpse of the Rav's character and personality. And allow me to share three qualities that I have found particularly meaningful. The first is the Rav throughout his life exhibited superlative moral sensitivity. A number of years ago, in the Dutch finance minister published a directive to all of the workers in the finance ministry that men are not allowed to wear white socks. And he wrote that a man wearing white socks with long pants transgresses the limits of decent dress behavior. Now, I have to tell you that a number of years ago, I told this story at ADATH in Shul, and I was worried that if I'm going to tell this story, maybe somebody is wearing white socks. A man might be wearing white socks, and they would be embarrassed. So what I did was, before I spoke, I walked up and down all of the rows on the men's section, checking out the socks of every single man who was there. And it was only when I realized that there was not a single man wearing white socks that I went ahead with this story. But so I certainly do not want to embarrass anybody. I'm just telling you what the Dutch finance minister did, and that leads me to this story. In the Rav's later years, remember, he lived in Boston, but he commuted and spent several days every week in Yeshiva University in New York, northern part of Manhattan. And in the later years, there would be someone who would stay with him to take care of it, to make sure he's okay, that he was eating properly, that he was going where he needed to go, any help that he needed. And a series of young men, students, had turns, and of course it was an unbelievable honor for a young student to be able to spend time in the direct, personal, private presence of the Rav Soloveitchik. And we have a number of stories from several of these individuals giving us a glimpse in the private life of the Rav. And one of the people who did this for a number of years is today Rabbi Kenny Brander. He's now a rabbi in Israel. I have the privilege to know him and think very, very highly of him. But many years ago, when he was still a student in Yeshiva University, he had this role of being kind of a personal aide to the Rav. So he tells a story that at the time he was dating the woman, Kenny was dating the woman that he was ultimately going to marry, his future wife. But he was living in the Rav's apartment. So he's getting dressed and he's ready to go out on his date. And the Rav stops him and says to him, "Where are you going?" And Kenny says, "I'm going on a date." And the Rav says, "You can't go on a date looking like that." He was wearing sneakers and white socks and like he had been to the gym. And the Rav said, it's not right to go on a date with someone you hope is going to be your future spouse. You should dress up, wear dress pants and dress socks and dress shoes. And Kenny said, our relationship is already quite advanced. We're beyond the stage where we need to impress each other with how we look. This is fine. And the Rav said, no, it's not okay. It's not okay. You have to get dressed. And then Kenny said, well, I'm a little bit embarrassed to mention, but I happen not to have any dark socks here. And the only socks I have are these white socks. And if I would have put on dress pants and dress shoes, I would never wear white socks with such an outfit. And I don't have dark socks. As soon as he said these words, Kenny felt terribly because the Rav, for years, always wore white socks. Suit, tie, hat, white socks, always. The Rav didn't say anything about the implication for his own sartorial practices, but the Rav said to him, here, come with me into my room. I have a drawer filled with dark socks. Take your pick, and you can look menschlich when you go on your date. So Kenny said, Rebbe, I don't understand. You only wear white socks. What are you doing with a full drawer of dark socks that you never ever wear? And the Rav told him that years earlier, his wife became ill. She eventually passed away from her illness. And in the latter part of her illness, she had difficulty seeing. And it was difficult for her to match dark pairs of socks because, they're very, very similar one to the other. Blue and black and gray and this pattern and that pattern. It can be very difficult. And she refused to allow anyone to help her. And so to make sure that she would not suffer the indignity of not being able to do something, the Rav bought for himself all white socks, and he only wore white socks, so it would not be a burden on his wife to be able to match them. And even after she died, he continued to wear those socks for the rest of his life. It's a private moment that expresses, again, a superlative sense of moral sensitivity and caring and preserving the dignity of another person. There's another famous story. The Rav lived in Boston, and one time he attended a concert of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. He enjoyed it very much, and he was watching the orchestra very, very carefully, and he noticed something. He noticed that the violin player was playing furiously the entire time. Of course, because it was a symphony, and the principal violin player, nonstop, the violin. And then there was another musician, the musician who played the cymbal. And only 3 times in the entire symphony did this musician clap the cymbals together. So the Rav thought to himself, what is the pay scale for the different musicians? Does the violinist get paid more because he's playing literally the entire time? And the cymbalist, he's only banging it together 3 times. So after the symphony, the Rav met the conductor. And he asked the conductor this question. And the conductor answered him with no hesitation, with definitive clarity. He said, of course, every musician is paid the exact same amount. Because even though it's true that one is playing the entire time and one is only playing 3 notes in the entire symphony, but without those 3 notes, the entire symphony loses its excellence, loses its wholeness. Every voice is needed to make up the whole. And the Rav had this attitude towards every Jewish person, regardless of ability or level or background, that they were absolutely essential to Klal Yisrael, to the Jewish people as a whole, and for all of humanity. The Rav had respect for every single human being, because every single human being is a necessary part of God's creation, God's symphony. The second characteristic I want to share with you, is the amazing intellectual integrity and humility. In Torah learning, the Rav only cared about arriving at the truth. So I heard this story from Rabbi Shlomo Riskin. He was a very close student of the Rav for many years, many years ago, early in the Rav's career. And Rabbi Riskin tells this story about being in the Rav Shir, the Rav's class. So the Rav gave public lectures where a few thousand people would attend, but he gave regular daily class to his students. And he gave, on the days that he was there, 2 a day, back to back. The first class was about 2 or 3 hours on Talmud, and the second class was about 2 or 3 hours on Shulchan Aruch, Code of Jewish Law. Back to back. The teaching style was quite different in the two contexts, because when the Rav gave a public address, of course, he was addressing the crowd. In class, it was interactive, and it was intense, meaning if you were in his class, you would be called on. And you would be expected to have the answer to the Rav's question. And you would be, you would feel, it would be clear from the Rav's response whether he thought that you had answered properly or not. He was demanding. So there was a younger student that Rabbi Riskin had befriended, and this younger student did not have such a strong Jewish background, but he was very, very smart. And Rabbi Riskin kind of took him under his wing and tried to help tutor him and saw his potential. And this student was not in the more advanced section of Yeshiva University, but more in the beginner section. But Rabbi Riskin felt that this student could potentially be able to keep up with the work in the Rav Shir. And Rabbi Riskin went to great effort to intervene to try to get this young man, who really was maybe not so prepared and deserving to be in this highest class, but he got him into the class. Rabbi Riskin sat front row right in front of the Rav. This student who came in sat in the back row, because he was terrified. And each class, Rabbi Riskin would encourage his friend, move 1 row closer, 1 row closer. Come on, it's okay. You'll be all right. 1 row, 1 row. Until finally, it happened that this young fellow was sitting in the row behind Rabbi Riskin. Okay. So as a class going on, it was a passage in the Talmud, a very complex passage in the Talmud. And the Rav presented a very elaborate, complex, multifaceted approach to understanding this subject. And then the Rav reversed himself and presented an entirely different understanding, just as complex, but with almost opposite conclusions. It was brilliant. It was really brilliant. Now, towards the end of this second part of the class, which was really a novel, creative interpretation that led to these consequences, the boy behind Riskin whispered to him, to Riskin. He whispered a question. And Riskin thought to himself, that's a really good question. This boy behind me has a really good question to ask. So he turned around to the boy and said, it's okay, ask. Ask the question. It's a good question, ask. So for the first time, this young man raised his hand and he asked his question out loud. And the Rav exploded. How can you ask such a foolish question? And with that, he ended the class, closed the book. Of course, this boy was smashed to the ground. Now, the Rav's practice, as I told you, he taught 2 classes back to back. He would stay in the classroom for the few minutes between the 2 classes. Rabbi Riskin was taking both of the classes, so he remained in the classroom after the end of the first class, waiting for the second class to begin, because he was taking the second class also. Now, usually what happened is when the Rav finished one class, he would close the book and he would immediately turn to the subject matter of the different class, completely different subject, and his ability to concentrate was just shifted completely from one subject just to a whole nother subject, and he's ready for the second class. But this time, the Rav opened up the Gemara from the first class, and he sat at his desk with his head on his arm, in silence, looking at the Gemara for about 20 minutes. And the students are watching, and no one knows what's going on. They've never seen the Rav do this. And he's just sitting there, his head in his hand. He's looking at the Gemara. After 20 minutes of this silence, the Rav looked up at Rabbi Riskin, and said, Riskin, that boy, what's his name? So I'll just make up his name is Cohen. So Riskin said, his name is Cohen. Cohen. Yes, Cohen. Where is he now? Take me to him. So if you're familiar with the Yeshiva University campus, so there's a cafeteria, and then across the street from the cafeteria, for decades, there have been a succession of fast food restaurants. At that time, there was a restaurant across the street. It was called Tov Ma'od, which literally means exceedingly good, but everybody called it the Greasy Spoon. Okay, you take your choice. So Riskin said to the Rav, he said, Rebbe, I think he's having lunch in the Greasy Spoon. And the Rav said, take me to him. So Rabbi Riskin is walking with the Rav down the sidewalk, and they enter this Greasy Spoon. It's, a student, tiny, fast food, greasy place. As soon as the Rav did not go to restaurants. Sometimes he ate at the cafeteria. Usually he ate in his apartment food that was prepared for him. When the Rav walked into this restaurant, which is all students from Yeshiva University, everybody stood up in respect, and they were shocked and they were alarmed. What is the Rav, the greatest scholar in the world, doing in the Greasy Spoon? Cohen wanted to go through the floor, especially once the Rav started walking toward him. And the Rav approached this boy, and he said to him, Cohen, you were right. I was wrong. Your question was actually a very good question. And in truth, it disproves my entire thesis. In next week's class, I'm going to provide an entirely new approach to this subject. Thank you, Cohen. And the Rav turned around walked out, and went back to his class. Just one example of many of the depth of intellectual honesty and integrity and humility that the Rav demonstrated throughout his life. One last quality. This is a lesson that the Rav taught in a shiur, a public lecture. The Torah tells us in the book of Shemos, Vayihi beredes Moshe mehar Sinai, and it was when Moshe came back down from Mount Sinai, Ushnei luchos ha'edus biad Moshe, beridito min ha'har, and the 2 tablets of stone, this was the second set of tablets, on which were engraved the Aseret Dibros, the 10 Commandments, were in Moshe's hands. And as Moshe came back down and the people saw him, Moshe lo yada, Moshe did not realize, ki koran or panav badabro ito, that as he was speaking to the Jewish people and started teaching them the Torah that God had taught him on Mount Sinai, Moshe did not realize that there were rays of light emanating from his face. The Rav taught there are 2 components to teaching Torah. One is formal teaching, with words. Moshe was the teacher par excellence. Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe our teacher. But the Rav explained that's not enough. It is also necessary for a teacher of Torah to radiate light, to be able to communicate the experiential aspect of what is being transmitted. Not just what to do, but how to feel and what our attitude should be towards what we are learning. What is the radiant, illuminating energy of the words that we are teaching? Karan or panav. Moshe had rays of light emanating from his face. His face was radiant when he taught Torah. This is the interpretation that the Rav gave, and then the Rav said about himself, I will tell you frankly, I do not know how to do it. I mentioned to you that the Rav would teach daily classes and also large public lectures. We have an account of one of those lectures from a lecture that occurred in the 1970s. It is a scene not likely to be repeated for a long time to come. A large assembly hall with several thousand people in attendance, young and old, men and women, learned rabbis and scholars, members of the academic community, Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews. They listen intently. On the podium is a tall, lean, gray-bearded figure delivering a lecture on the fine points of Jewish law and Jewish thought. His subject is complex and subtle, but he will hold his diverse audience in thrall for 2 or 3 hours. Another student wrote, of course, nothing can substitute for being at the Rav's lectures. The eloquence of expression, the art of sculpturing concrete verbal images in such precise detail that they seem a reality, the soaring poetry of a visionary, the mood-evoking magic of an extraordinary storyteller, and finally, the ability to fashion a bond of existential fellowship among all those present, and anyone who has heard the Rav speak knows how well he does this. All of these cannot be captured by the printed word. Allow me to conclude with respectfully disagreeing with the Rav just this one time. In late 1980, I had the privilege to attend several of his public lectures in person. I will never forget the contrast between the simple setting, the Rav, seated at a small table with a microphone and notes and a glass of water, no dais, no multimedia, no theatrics, and the symphonic complexity and beauty of the deep and novel insights, the precise structure, the lyric language. I saw heavenly rays of light on the Rav's face. He did it. He accomplished for our generation what Moshe did for his. He transmitted to us the words and the light of Torah. Rabbi Yosef Soloveitchik, of blessed memory. May his memory be a blessing and inspiration to all of us for generations to come. My friends, I wish you a great day and a beautiful Shabbos, and I look forward to seeing you soon in person.